The Astronomican went dark for 17 seconds. 17 seconds in which every navigator in the segmentum obscurus felt their third eye burn blind. Every astropath screamed hymns they had never learned, and every soul touched by the Emperor's light tasted ash and copper on their tongue. When the beam rekindled, something fundamental had changed. The warp was still, not calm, not quiet. Still, like a predator holding its breath. Magos Vethric, 9 of the Adeptus Mechanicus orbital station throne's calculus, was the first to understand what the sensor arrays were reporting, and the knowledge made his organic brain matter seize with something his augmetics could not process. Fear, perhaps, or recognition of a truth so vast it shattered doctrine. The data was impossible, yet irrefutable. Every daemon trace across 14 subsectors had simply ceased to exist, not banished, not dormant, erased. Vethric's mechadendrites trembled as he triple-verified the readings, invoking litanies to the Omnissiah that suddenly felt hollow in his vocalizer. The eye of terror remained visible in long-range auger sweeps, a wound in reality's fabric that still leaked radiation and quantum instability. But the things that crawled through that wound, the entities that had turned the galaxy into an abattoir of souls for 10,000 years, were gone. The warp itself persisted as the dimension through which mankind traveled between stars, turbulent and dangerous as it had always been. But the intelligence behind that malice, the fourfold powers that had orchestrated corruption and damnation across every corner of the Imperium, had vanished as though they had never been. Within 6 hours, the Inquisition issued Mandate Absolute Sigma 9. Every astropath, every sanctioned psyker, every soul with even minor warp sight was to report their observations under pain of summary execution. The responses flooded in through every relay station still operational after millennia of grinding war. The reports were uniform in their impossibility. The voices were silent. The whispers that had plagued humanity since before Old Night, the seductions and threats and promises that echoed in every psyker's skull, had stopped. The Emperor's light still burned from terror, but it no longer fought back an encroaching tide. It simply illuminated an empty ocean. On the cardinal world of Ophelia 7, Saint Celestine manifested before the Ecclesiarch's throne and spoke words that would be suppressed from all official records within the week. She told them the Emperor had moved, not in flesh but in purpose, and that the great game board upon which he had played against the ruinous powers for 100 centuries had been swept clean. Whether by his hand or by some other force beyond mortal comprehension, she could not say. Her voice carried no joy, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from winning a war you never expected to survive. The immediate aftermath was not celebration. It was paralysis. The Imperium of man had organized every facet of its existence around the eternal struggle against chaos. Its theology, its military doctrine, its very reason for the Emperor's imprisonment upon the Golden Throne revolved around containing and combating the daemonic. Entire orders of the Adepta Sororitas existed solely to purge the taint of corruption. The Grey Knights, that most secret chapter, had been forged in gene labs with the singular purpose of destroying that which could not die. The Inquisition's Ordo Malleus had spent 10 millennia hunting the possessed and the damned. Now their enemy was gone, and the machinery of the Imperium ground forward on momentum alone, uncertain whether to halt or accelerate. Lord Commander Guilliman received the news in the strategium of the Times Macrages Honor Times while planning the relief of Baal. He stood motionless for a full minute, his transhuman mind processing implications that would have broken mortal cognition. Then he dismissed every officer in the chamber and locked himself within for 3 days. When he emerged, his face was set in an expression his equerry had never seen before. Not hope, not relief, calculation. Cold, brutal calculation. The Primarch issued orders that restructured the entire Indomitus Crusade's objectives. The fleets moving to reinforce worlds against Black Crusades were redirected. Every vessel, every regiment, every resource previously allocated to the endless war against chaos was reassigned with surgical precision. Because Guilliman understood what most of the Imperium's faithful could not yet grasp, the galaxy had not become safer, it had become simpler, and in simplicity there was a terrible clarity. The Tyranid hive fleets had always been slowed by the warp storms that chaos spawned, their bioships unable to navigate the Empyrion's most turbulent regions. They traveled in real space, following the psychic beacon of living minds, and the warp's instability had been an unintentional shield across vast portions of the galaxy. With chaos silenced, those barriers dissolved. Hive fleet Leviathans surged forward with a speed that overwhelmed every predictive model the Mechanicus had constructed. Hive fleet Kronos, which had evolved specifically to consume psychers and close warp rifts, found itself without purpose and turned its full attention to consuming standard biomass with unprecedented efficiency. Hive fleet Behemoth, thought destroyed at Macragge, revealed splinter groups that had been lying dormant in the void between stars, waiting for some cosmic signal that finally arrived. The shadow in the warp intensified. That psychic null zone the Tyranids projected as they traveled grew denser, more oppressive. Astropaths who attempted to send messages through systems near Tyranid approach vectors went mad before they could complete transmission. The silence that had been Chaos's absence became something worse. A predatory void that consumed not just thoughts but the very capacity to think them. Worlds that had held out against heretic invasion for decades fell to the hive mind in weeks. The Great Devourer accelerated its consumption, and there was no longer a convenient daemon incursion to thin its numbers or divert its attention. In the Sautek dynasty's tomb world of Borsis, Overlord Sarek, the Silent King himself, felt a tremor pass through the living metal of his necrodermis. His chronomantic algorithms had detected the impossibility the moment it occurred. The warp entities, those beings of pure emotional resonance that had defied the natural order since the war in heaven, had been removed from the equation. The Silent King had spent 60 million years preparing for the possibility that the Chetan's ancient enemies might need to be confronted again. He had returned from the void beyond the galaxy's edge, with strategies and weapons designed to fight chaos itself if necessary. Now those plans were obsolete, but new possibilities emerged. The Necrons had always struggled against the warp's chaotic nature. Their technology was built on physical laws, on mathematical certainties that the Imperium defied by its very existence. Chaos had made true galactic dominance impossible for a species that possessed neither souls nor warp presence. With that obstacle removed, the playing field had fundamentally shifted. Sarek immediately dispatched awakening protocols to every tomb world within the Sautek dynasty's influence. Tomb complexes that had been scheduled for resurrection over the course of millennia were activated simultaneously. The Necron legions rose with a singular purpose: expansion. Uncontested, unlimited expansion. The Cryptex began construction of new world engines, planetoid-sized war machines capable of cracking worlds and harvesting their resources. The Triarch Praetorians, those wandering guardians of the Necron race's ancient laws, returned to the dynasties with reports of Xenos, civilizations now vulnerable without chaos to occupy imperial attention. The destroyer cults, those nihilistic Necrons who sought only to exterminate all organic life, found their mad logic suddenly validated. Without chaos to corrupt and transform the living, only one solution remained to ensure the galaxy's peace: complete sterilization. But the Necrons faced their own internal contradictions. The dynasties had never been truly united. Imhotep, the Stormlord of the Sautek dynasty, pursued methodical conquest and technological supremacy. Anrakir the Traveler sought to awaken and protect all sleeping Necrons. The Maynarch dynasty wanted nothing but slaughter. Trazyn the Infinite continued his obsessive collection of historical artifacts, treating entire species as museum pieces. Without the common threat of chaos to occasionally force temporary alliances, the Necron dynasties turned on each other with the same cold precision they applied to lesser races. On the crone world of Lugganath, Farseer Kelmon Deathsong cast the runes and watched them scatter in patterns that defied interpretation. The Eldar had lived with the curse of Slanesh for 10,000 years. She who thirsts had been born from their species' fall, a god of excess and suffering that claimed every Eldar soul not protected by spirit stones or constant sacrifice. The Farseers had woven their craft world's entire existence around avoiding that fate, charting paths through futures where she who thirsts did not catch them. Now the great enemy was gone, and the paths were empty. Kelmon felt the absence like a missing tooth, a hole where agony had always been. The spirit stones still functioned, still captured Eldar souls at death, but the ravenous hunger that had always threatened to crack them open and devour what lay within had simply ceased. Infinity circuits across every craft world sang with confusion and terrified hope. The Ynnari, those followers of the death god Ennead, found their entire purpose suddenly uncertain. They had sought to awaken their god fully to battle Slaanesh, but if Slaanesh was already gone, what need remained for their bloody resurrection? Yvraine, the emissary of Ennead, stood in the halls of Comorag and felt the dark city shift beneath her feet. The Drukhari had sustained themselves through torture and suffering, feeding on the pain of others to stave off the slow consumption of their souls. Without Slaanesh's eternal hunger gnawing at them, that need diminished, not eliminated. The Dark Eldar had twisted themselves too thoroughly to simply return to innocence. But the desperate edge, the frantic necessity that drove them to ever greater atrocities, softened. Some among the Cabal saw opportunity for expansion without the constant need to feed she who thirsts. Others saw it as a trap, a lure toward complacency that would destroy them more thoroughly than any daemon. The Harlequins danced new performances in the Black Library, their masks, hiding faces twisted with uncertainty. The laughing god's great jest had been surviving Slaanesh's birth. Now that the punchline had changed, they needed new stories. Segorak's servants whispered that perhaps this was always meant to be, that the Eldar's fall and suffering had been necessary steps toward this moment. But the Harlequins were storytellers, and they knew how easily a narrative could be twisted to justify anything. Craftworld Bieltan's autarchs saw the galaxy spread before them like a feast. Without chaos to occupy the Imperium's full attention, humanity's expansion had accelerated into Eldar-claimed worlds with renewed aggression. But without chaos to weaken humanity from within, the Imperium's full might could be brought to bear. Bieltan had always advocated for aggressive reclamation of the old Eldar Empire. Now that path seemed both more possible and infinitely more dangerous. The wild growth, the concept that the Eldar could reclaim their former glory by force, became the dominant philosophy. Strike forces launched from the craft world with a frequency not seen since before the fall. The Exodites, those Eldar who had fled to primitive worlds and bonded with world spirits to escape Slaanesh's birth, found themselves increasingly targeted. Without chaos corruption to avoid, Imperial survey fleets penetrated deeper into unexplored space. Agri-worlds were needed to feed the Emperor's endless armies. The Exodites' planets, pristine and fertile, became priority targets. The world spirits fought back, but they were ancient and slow to rouse. Against the Imperium's mechanized warfare, against the Tyranids' consumption, even against the Necrons' awakening, the Exodites were vulnerable in ways they had not been when chaos required all predators to watch their own backs. In the Octarius sector, war boss Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka felt something he had never experienced before. Clarity. The Orcs lived for war, thrived on it, grew stronger in its presence. Chaos had always been an enemy too strange, too unorky to truly satisfy. Daemons did not bleed proper, did not fight with good honest violence. They cheated with warp tricks and corruption. Now they were gone, and what remained was pure, beautiful war against enemies that bled and died and fought back with proper weapons. The greatest war boss in the galaxy looked across the stars and saw infinite battlefields unmarred by daemonic nonsense. The great WAAAGH that Gazkul had been building for decades suddenly found new purpose. He called every war boss who would listen, every clan that craved a good fight, and pointed them at targets that had previously been too risky. Chaos-held worlds were now just empty real estate to be conquered. Imperial worlds previously protected by their value as bulwarks against heretic invasion were now just targets. The Orcs did not care about strategy or politics. They cared about fighting, and the galaxy had just become an infinitely simpler place to find it. Orc WAR energies intensified. That psychic field the greenskins generated, the one that made their ramshackle technology function through sheer belief, grew stronger without Chaos's competing warp presence. Guns that should not fire suddenly became more reliable. Spacecraft that violated every law of physics flew faster. Entire WAAGH. It's that should have torn themselves apart through infighting, instead focused their aggression outward with unprecedented coordination. Not because orcs became smarter or more organized, but because there were simply more valid targets and fewer distractions. The Octarius War, that grinding conflict where the Imperium had deliberately engineered an orc and tyrannid collision to keep both occupied, ended not with exhaustion but with expansion. The survivors, tempered by constant warfare against the ultimate enemy, exploded outward in all directions. Orc spores spread across hundreds of systems, each one seeded with greenskins who had learned to fight tyrannids and lived. They brought that knowledge to their WAAGHS, and the Imperium found itself facing orcs more dangerous than any since the War of the Beast. But the orcs also turned on each other with renewed enthusiasm. Without chaos to occasionally unite them against demonic incursions, the natural orc tendency toward tribal warfare intensified. Goths fought snakebites. Bad moons hired themselves out as mercenaries against blood axes. Entire WA arcs collided in deep space over nothing more than which warboss was bigger. The orcs' chaotic nature, previously partially focused by the need to occasionally fight chaos itself, became pure internecine violence, punctuated by raids against anyone foolish enough to be nearby. On Terra itself, the Adeptus Custodes stood watch over the Golden Throne and felt their purpose shift. For 10,000 years, they had guarded the Emperor's dying form, had fought off daemon incursions in the Imperial Palace, had stood as the last line between humanity's God and the Ruinous Powers' corruption. That threat was gone. The webway gate beneath the palace, that wound torn open during the Horus heresy that Magnus the Red's folly had created, no longer spewed daemons. The custodians who had fought in the eternal war within those tunnels emerged for the first time in millennia, their guardian spears slick with the last remnants of enemies that would spawn no more. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood before the Eternity Gate and considered the implications. The Emperor still sat the Golden Throne. His psychic might still powered the Astronomican, but the mechanism that had trapped him there, the constant effort required to hold shut the webway breach and fight back the daemonic tide, had changed. The Mechanicus reported that power consumption from the throne had decreased by orders of magnitude, not eliminated. The Emperor was not healing, not rising, not speaking, but the burden had lessened. Some among the custodes whispered that the Emperor had finally won, that he had spent 10,000 years locked in psychic combat with the Chaos Gods themselves, and in whatever metaphysical arena that war was fought, he had achieved victory. Others claimed it was a trick, that Chaos feigned death to lure the Imperium into complacency. The custodians increased their vigilance rather than relaxing it, because they understood that unknown threats were more dangerous than familiar ones. The Sisters of Silence, those null maidens who had fought alongside the custodes, found their purpose similarly altered. They existed to combat psychers and daemons, to bring the Emperor's peace to those corrupted by the warp. With chaos silenced, their attention turned to other threats. Rogue psychers still existed. The warp itself remained dangerous. But the demonic element, the constant threat of possession and corruption, had been removed from the equation. The sisters began hunting warp Xenos with renewed focus. Enslavers, Psychnuine, other Empyrean predators that were not chaos but still threatened humanity. In the Segmentum Solar, the High Lords of Terra convened in emergency session. They were administrators and politicians, not warriors, and they understood better than most what chaos's absence truly meant. The Imperium had been structured around constant crisis. The threat of heresy and corruption had justified every excess, every atrocity, every grinding sacrifice of human life and dignity. It had been the ultimate excuse for authoritarian control. Without it, the justification for the Imperium's harshest measures became questionable. Unrest began in the hive cities first. Worlds that had accepted brutal conditions because chaos was the alternative started questioning whether such suffering remained necessary. The Adeptus Arbites found themselves overwhelmed by riots and rebellion, not the corruption of chaos, but simple human desperation. The Departamento Munitorum struggled to maintain recruitment levels when the threat of demonic invasion no longer loomed over every planet. Young men and women who would have volunteered to die in the Emperor's service to prevent a worse fate now asked why they should throw their lives away at all. The Ecclesiarchy faced the most profound crisis. Their entire theology revolved around the Emperor as protector against chaos. They preached that suffering in his name was necessary to keep the daemons at bay. Now the daemons were gone, and the suffering continued. Preachers who tried to maintain the old doctrines found themselves facing congregations that demanded answers. Some clerics adapted, claiming the Emperor's victory over chaos proved his divinity beyond question. Others doubled down, insisting that chaos would return, and only constant vigilance kept it at bay. A few, a dangerous few, began preaching that perhaps humanity no longer needed the Emperor's protection at all. The Inquisition moved to suppress this last category with extreme prejudice. The Ordo Hereticus, designed to root out internal corruption, found itself busier than ever, because chaos had been an easy enemy to identify. Corruption showed in visible mutation, in psychic taint, in actions that violated reality itself. But philosophical dissent was harder to quantify. How did you prove someone was a heretic when they claimed to love the Emperor but questioned the Ecclesiarchy's interpretation of his will? The Inquisition began burning libraries and executing scholars with the same fervor they had once reserved for demon worshippers. Lord Inquisitor Cryptman, who had orchestrated the Octarius War, found himself arrested by his own Ordo. His crime, suggesting that perhaps the Imperium should negotiate with the Tau Empire rather than viewing every Xenos as an enemy. Such thoughts had been unthinkable when chaos threatened to corrupt any alliance. But now, with the greatest enemy removed, Realpolitik entered conversations that had previously been purely ideological. Cryptman died under interrogation, but his ideas did not. They spread through the Inquisition like a virus, dividing that monolithic organization into factions that had previously been united by common purpose. The Adeptus Mechanicus faced their own schism. The quest for knowledge had always been tempered by the danger of chaos corruption. Technologies deemed too dangerous to research, too likely to attract demonic attention, had been forbidden. Now those restrictions felt arbitrary. Archmagos Call, who had already pushed boundaries in his work, creating Primaris Space Marines, began advocating for unrestricted research. He argued that the Mechanicus had handicapped itself for 10,000 years, and that without chaos to fear, they could finally pursue true innovation. The traditionalists within the Mechanicus saw such thoughts as the first step toward tech heresy. They pointed out that the Men of Iron, those AI constructs that had nearly destroyed humanity during Old Night, had not been creatures of chaos. Danger existed beyond the warp. The fact that demonic corruption no longer threatened did not mean all forbidden knowledge was safe. The Fabricator General of Mars found himself mediating between factions that were one step away from open warfare. Forge worlds chose sides. Titan legions aligned with competing philosophies. The Red Planet teetered on the edge of civil war. In the Eastern Fringe, Commander Farsight of the Tau Empire received intelligence reports that initially seemed too optimistic to believe. The Imperium, that endless human juggernaut that pressed against Tau space with inexhaustible armies, had suddenly diverted vast resources away from the Damocles Gulf. Farsight was old enough and wise enough to be suspicious. He had fought the Imperium for centuries. He knew they did not simply abandon strategic positions without reason. The truth became clear when Tau watercaste diplomats reported something unprecedented. Multiple imperial worlds had responded to Tau overtures with actual negotiation rather than immediate rejection, not alliance, not friendship, but a willingness to discuss non-aggression pacts and trade agreements that would have been impossible before. The Tau ethereals saw opportunity. The greater good had always been hindered by the Imperium's fanaticism. If that fanaticism was fracturing, perhaps the Tau could expand through diplomacy rather than warfare. But Farsight, separated from the ethereal's influence by distance and experience, saw the larger pattern. The Imperium was not weakening, It was refocusing. Every asset pulled away from the Tau border was being redeployed against the Tyranids or the Necrons. Humanity was not embracing peace. It was triaging its wars. Farsight sent encrypted warnings to his former sept, but he knew they would not listen. The Ethereals were convinced they could exploit the Imperium's moment of transition. They could not see that the galaxy had become more dangerous, not less, because the rules had changed. The Tyranid hive fleets reached the Tau Empire's core worlds within a decade of Chaos's disappearance. The Tau fought with discipline and technology, with advanced battlesuits and coordinated firecast strategies. They inflicted casualties that would have crippled any conventional army. But the hive mind did not care about casualties. It cared about biomass, and the Tau worlds were rich with it. The shadow in the warp descended over the eastern fringe, cutting off the Tau from their allies, drowning out their communications, leaving each sept to die alone and unaware that others had already fallen. Farsight's enclave survived longer than most. He had always been a warrior first, had understood that the galaxy was not kind to the naive. He fortified his worlds and fought a desperate retreat, trading space for time. But even he could not hold back the endless swarm forever. The last transmission from the Tau Empire's core worlds was a simple message. We were wrong. The greater good is not enough. The galaxy is too vast and too hungry. The Necrons and Tyranids collided across 1,000 systems in what became known as the War of Silent Hunger. Neither side communicated, neither side negotiated or retreated strategically. The Tyranids consumed all biomass they encountered. The Necrons methodically exterminated all organic life they detected. It was a war of absolute annihilation, and the galaxy watched with morbid fascination to see which extinction would prevail. The Necrons held advantages in durability and technology. Gauss flares disintegrated Tyranid bioforms on a molecular level. Doomsday cannons cracked hive ships in single shots. The Tyranids could not adapt their biology to Necron technology the way they adapted to conventional weapons. But the hive mind learned. It could not corrupt Necrons with biological agents, so it developed organisms designed purely to disable and disassemble. Massive carnifexes with nothing but mechanical disruption organs. Lictors that targeted Tomb World resurrection nodes. The Swarmlord itself led assaults against Necron tomb ships, dueling overlords with a tactical sophistication that evolved with each engagement. Neither side could truly win. The Necrons could not permanently stop the Tyranids because the hive fleet spawned faster than Necron legions awakened. The Tyranids could not consume the Necrons because living metal contained no biomass to harvest. The war reached a stalemate measured in dead worlds and sterilized systems. Entire sectors became lifeless voids where only machines and monsters fought among the ruins. The Imperium watched this war and made a choice that would define the next era. They helped neither side. Instead, they fortified the regions surrounding the conflict and let the two Xenos threats bleed each other dry. It was the Cryptman gambit on a galactic scale, and it worked precisely because neither the Tyranids nor the Necrons could be negotiated with or corrupted. The Imperium pulled back from untenable positions, abandoned border worlds, and established fortress lines behind which they could rebuild. This consolidation saved the Imperium. For the first time in millennia, resources were not divided between a dozen existential threats. The Departamento Munitorum could focus its recruitment and logistics on specific objectives. The Imperial Navy could concentrate its fleets rather than spreading them thin across the galaxy. The Astra Militarum launched coordinated campaigns with actual strategic planning rather than desperate reactionary deployments. Guilliman's strategy revealed its full scope. He was not trying to conquer the galaxy. He was trying to preserve humanity's core territories while the Xenos tore themselves apart fighting each other. It was brutal. It abandoned billions to die on worlds outside the new defensive perimeter. But it was rational in a way the Imperium had not been for 10,000 years. The Primarch was accused of heresy by more than one cardinal. He ignored them. He had walked among humanity for centuries now. He understood that the Imperium his father had built was dying. He needed to build something that could survive in a galaxy without chaos to blame for every failure. The Space Marine chapters found themselves in crisis. They were the Emperor's angels of death, created to fight his enemies wherever they appeared. But many chapters had defined themselves by their war against chaos. The Dark Angels' hunt for the fallen lost urgency when half the traitors they sought had likely died with chaos itself. The Blood Angels' battle against the Black Rage became more manageable when demonic influence no longer inflamed their genetic curse. The Space Wolves' wild nature, once barely contained when fighting chaos, needed new outlets. Some chapters embraced the change. The Ultramarines, always practical, adapted their tactics to focus on Xenos threats. The Salamanders turned their attention to protecting Imperial civilians from Orc raids and Tyranid splinters. The Imperial Fists fortified the approaches to terror with a dedication that bordered on obsession. But other chapters struggled. The Exorcists, who had used demonic possession as part of their initiation rites, found their defining tradition obsolete. The Grey Knights, created specifically to fight demons, faced an existential question. What was their purpose in a galaxy without demonic threats? The answer came from an unexpected source. Kaldor Drygo, Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, emerged from the warp after subjective centuries trapped there fighting chaos. He arrived in real space to find his eternal enemy gone, and rather than despair, he laughed. It was a sound none of his brothers had ever heard from him. He gathered the Grey Knights and told them a truth he had learned in his long exile. The warp was still full of predators, enslavers, Psychnuine, things that had no names. The Grey Knights would hunt them all. The chapter reconfigured itself for this new mission. They still used their sanctified weapons, still wielded psychic powers, still wore blessed armor. But they hunted different prey. They traveled to worlds on the edge of warp storms and purged Xenos threats that fed on psychic energy. They escorted black ships through the most dangerous routes, protecting the precious cargo of psychers from predators that were not chaos but equally deadly. The Grey Knights survived because they adapted, and in doing so, they showed other chapters how to remain relevant, but some Space Marines could not adapt. The Red Corsairs, who had fallen to chaos under Huron Blackheart, simply vanished when chaos disappeared. Whether they died, reverted to humanity, or scattered into the void, none could say. Other renegade chapters found themselves hunted by the Imperium with unprecedented efficiency. Without chaos to hide behind, without demon allies to call upon, renegade Space Marines were just exceptionally dangerous mortals. The Imperium's full might crushed them systematically. The loyalist chapters that had harbored doubts, that had questioned the Imperium's methods, found themselves with space to voice those concerns. The Marines errant began taking contracts as mercenaries, defending specific worlds in exchange for resources, rather than following Departamento Munitorum directives. The Lamenters, long cursed with bad luck, suddenly found themselves winning battles they should have lost. Some whispered that chaos had been the source of their curse all along, but the Lamenters themselves did not care. They simply fought harder, trying to redeem their reputation while their luck held. Across the Imperium, psychers reported dreams, not nightmares, not the whispers of chaos, just dreams. They dreamed of a golden figure who watched from a throne of bones and technology. They dreamed of a war that had lasted forever, and a peace that felt like emptiness. The dreams were not commands. They were more like observations, as if something vast and inhuman was noticing the galaxy for the first time in millennia. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica struggled to interpret these visions. Every psyker experienced them differently, but the core imagery remained consistent. The Emperor was present in these dreams, but he was not as Scripture depicted. He was not the benevolent godfather of humanity. He was something older, colder, more alien. A being that had fought the gods themselves, and won not through righteousness, but through sheer will. The implications terrified those who understood them. Some tech priests began researching the Golden Throne with renewed focus. Without chaos to fear, they could examine the mechanisms more closely. What they discovered was classified by order of the Fabricator General himself, but rumors leaked. The Golden Throne was not just keeping the Emperor alive, it was changing him. The constant strain of holding back chaos for 10,000 years had transformed whatever the Emperor had been into something different. The tech priests could not agree on whether this transformation was complete or ongoing, whether it was ascension or degradation. They could only confirm that the being on the golden throne was no longer entirely human, if he had ever been. This knowledge did not leave the Mechanicus. It could not. The Imperium required faith, and faith required a God who was comprehensible. A being that transcended humanity entirely, that had become something utterly alien through 10 millennia of suffering, was not a God anyone could worship. The truth was suppressed, locked in data vaults on Mars, and guarded by Skitarii who would die before allowing it to spread. But in the hidden places of the Imperium, among the scholars and the heretics and the desperate, whispers spread of a galaxy that had survived its greatest threat, only to discover it was still doomed. Because the Tyranids were infinite, the Necrons were awakening, the Orcs bred faster than they could be killed, and the Imperium, stripped of the enemy that had defined it, was fracturing into competing interests that would soon turn on each other. In the depths of the webway, in those ancient Eldar tunnels that humanity had tried and failed to claim, something stirred. The daemonettes that had infested those passages were gone. The bloodletters that had hunted there for 10,000 years had vanished, but the webway itself remained, and it was vast beyond comprehension. The Eldar had built their empire through these tunnels, had connected every craft world and maiden world through this interdimensional highway. Much of it was ruined now, collapsed or corrupted beyond use. But much remained intact, waiting for anyone clever enough to navigate its dangers. The Dark Eldar of Komorog realized the opportunity first. They had always used the webway to raid real space, striking from nowhere and vanishing before retaliation could arrive. Now, with Slaanesh gone and the webway safer than it had been in millennia, they could expand their domain. Archons launched expeditions into long-sealed sections, seeking new routes to virgin systems rich with slaves and suffering. Homunculi analyzed the webway's structure, attempting to understand its mechanisms without the corrupting influence of chaos interfering. What they found in those forgotten tunnels was neither chaos nor salvation. They found evidence that the webway was older than the Eldar themselves, that the ancient species had discovered it, not built it, that something else, something from a time before the Khartan shattered the old ones, had constructed these passages for purposes the current galaxy could not comprehend. The Dark Eldar reported their findings to no one. They simply used the webway as they always had, caring nothing for its origins as long as it served their purpose. But the Harlequins knew. They had always known. The Laughing God's servants had traveled the webway for as long as their race existed, and they understood its true nature better than any other faction. They said nothing, because speaking the truth would accomplish nothing. The galaxy was not ready to understand that the webway was a weapon, or a prison, or both. That it had been built to contain something, and that something had been forgotten so thoroughly that not even the Cetan remembered it. In the Eye of Terror, reality had not healed. The warp storm still raged, still warped space and time into impossible geometries, but the daemon worlds that had existed there simply ceased. The planets remained, barren and twisted, but empty of the horrors that had spawned there for 10 millennia. Imperial scout ships that ventured into the Eye reported lifeless rocks and shattered space stations. The traitor legions were gone, the fallen Primarchs were gone, whether they had died with chaos or fled to some unknowable dimension, the Imperium could not determine. They simply were not there. The Cadian Gate, that strategic choke point which had held back the forces of chaos for 10,000 years, stood undefended. Not because the Imperium had abandoned it, but because there was nothing left to defend against. The fortress worlds that had been built there, layer upon layer of fortifications and gun emplacements, sat silent and purposeless. The Cadian regiments, those soldiers who had been born and raised knowing they stood at the edge of damnation, found themselves without an enemy. Some requested reassignment to the Tyranid front. Others simply stood their posts, unable to believe the war was truly over, waiting for the inevitable betrayal, because it had to be a trick. That was what every veteran of the Long War believed. Chaos was eternal. The dark gods were born from emotion itself, from the rage and despair and ambition that lived in every sentient mind. They could not die. They could not simply vanish. And yet the evidence was irrefutable. Every world that had fallen to chaos corruption reported miraculous cleansing. Possessed individuals woke from their nightmares with no memory of what they had done. Chaos Space Marines who had fought for 10,000 years simply ceased to exist, their armor falling empty to the ground, their weapons clattering against stone as if their wielders had been erased from reality mid-swing. Interrogator Chaplain Asmodai of the Dark Angels captured one of the fallen during a raid on a former traitor stronghold. He prepared his ritual questions, his instruments of pain and prayer, ready to extract confession and absolution. But the fallen simply stared at him with empty eyes and said, "I remember nothing. There was a voice that promised me power, and then silence. I do not know who I am anymore." Asmodai killed him anyway, because it was doctrine, but he reported the incident to Azrael, Supreme Grand Master of the chapter. Azrael ordered the report destroyed and never spoke of it again. The Imperium's territories began to shift. Without chaos corruption spreading from hidden cults, without demonic incursions requiring immediate response, the standard mechanisms of imperial control functioned with unprecedented efficiency. Planetary governors who had embezzled resources while claiming chaos required their attention found themselves audited and executed. Corrupt officials who had blamed every failure on heretic sabotage were exposed and purged. The Adeptus Arbites, freed from chasing daemon worshippers, turned their attention to mundane crime and found it endemic. The hive cities erupted in violence, not the violence of chaos corruption, but the violence of humans pushed beyond endurance, discovering they no longer had to accept their suffering. Gangs that had operated in the Underhive for centuries found themselves crushed between rival factions, now fighting for genuine control rather than just survival. The Lex Imperialis was enforced with brutal efficiency, but it could not be everywhere at once. Entire hive spires declared independence, ejecting imperial authority and establishing their own governance. Most were put down within months. Some held out for years. A few actually succeeded, creating pocket states within the Imperium that no one had resources to reclaim while Xenos threatened the borders. Lord Guilliman watched this internal chaos with carefully concealed satisfaction. He needed the Imperium to adapt, to evolve beyond the rigid doctrine that had calcified over 10 millennia. If that evolution required breaking a few hidebound traditions, so be it. He redirected Astra Militarum forces away from the rebellious hives and towards Xenos threats, letting local enforcers handle insurrection. The message was clear: you are on your own, adapt or die. Many worlds chose to adapt. They established councils, created laws that actually served their populations, found ways to meet imperial tithes while still maintaining quality of life. These worlds became examples of what the Imperium could be, but many more chose tradition. They declared the reforms heresy, insisted that suffering was holy, that the Emperor demanded sacrifice. These worlds fractured from within, as progressive and conservative factions warred in the streets. The Ministorum sent preachers to restore faith. Many of those preachers were lynched by crowds who blamed the Ecclesiarchy for 10,000 years of unnecessary pain. The Adepta Sororitas deployed to protect remaining churches and found themselves fighting not cultists, but ordinary citizens who demanded the Imperium justify its existence. Canoness Heloise of the Order of the Bloody Rose stood in the ruins of a cathedral on Meridian Prime and felt her faith waver for the first time in 2 centuries of service. She had killed 14 people that day. Not heretics, not traitors, just humans who wanted to live without constant fear, who asked why the God Emperor demanded such suffering when the greatest enemy was gone. She had no answer. The Ecclesiarchy's doctrine did not prepare her for this. She executed the survivors anyway, because it was her duty, then locked herself in the cathedral's ruins and prayed until her knees bled. The Emperor did not answer. He never did. She rose, cleaned her bolter, and marched back to war, because faith did not require understanding. The Tyrannid advance accelerated. Hive Fleet Leviathan reached the Segmentum Solar within 15 years of Chaos's disappearance. The hive mind had learned from every engagement, had adapted to every weapon the Imperium deployed. Bioships now generated their own warp shadows so intense that entire systems went silent before the fleet even arrived. The Imperium's warning networks collapsed. Worlds died without ever calling for help. By the time relief forces arrived, there was nothing left but barren rock and the lingering psychic void where billions of minds had been consumed. Terra itself prepared for siege. The Imperial fists fortified the Sol system with every defense they could manufacture. Orbital platforms bristled with weapons. Minefields filled the space between planets. Gun satellites formed a sphere around Terra so dense that no approach vector remained uncovered. The custodians stood ready at the Eternity Gate, their guardian spears charged and blessed. The Sisters of Silence took positions throughout the Imperial Palace, ready to bring their null fields against the shadow in the warp. But the Tyranids did not attack Terra. The hive mind, demonstrating intelligence that terrified Imperial strategists, simply went around. It consumed the agri-worlds that fed Terra. It destroyed the forge worlds that armed Terra. It isolated the throne world without ever coming within weapons range. Within a decade, Terra was cut off, unable to export or import anything, surrounded by a galaxy that continued to burn while the heart of the Imperium sat impotent and starving. Guilliman made the decision that would be debated by Imperial historians for the rest of human existence. He abandoned Terra, not physically. He left the Custodians and the Adeptus Arbites, and enough forces to hold the Sol system indefinitely. But he took the Imperium's mobile assets, every fleet and regiment that could move, and redeployed them to Ultramar. He established a secondary capital on Macragge, claimed authority as Lord Commander, and essentially split the Imperium in two. Those loyal to Terra remained there, holding a besieged capital that controlled nothing beyond its own star system. Those who followed Guilliman's practical approach relocated to Ultramar and began building what he called the Imperium Secundus. The Ecclesiarchy declared this the greatest heresy in Imperial history. The High Lords of Terra named Guilliman traitor and excommunicate. It meant nothing. Guilliman controlled the armies, the fleets, the resources. Terra had legitimacy and tradition and nothing else. The Primarch did not declare independence. He simply acted as if Terra no longer mattered, and within a generation, it did not. Ultramar became the new heart of human space, and Terra became a shrine world, important symbolically but irrelevant strategically. The Emperor said nothing, or perhaps he could not. The Golden Throne still functioned, still projected the Astronomican, though its reach had diminished as systems fell to the Tyranids and the light had fewer minds to guide. Psychers who meditated on the Emperor's presence reported the same sensation, watching. The God Emperor of mankind observed everything and acted not at all. Whether this was divine plan or simple incapacity, none could say. In the eastern fringe, the Tyranids and Necrons continued their war of extinction. The Swarmlord had been killed and reborn 14 times, each iteration learning from previous defeats. It had developed tactics specifically designed to counter Necron reanimation protocols, bioforms that could disrupt resurrection, that could consume the energy matrices powering living metal, that could target tomb world nodes with precision strikes. The Necrons adapted in turn. They developed weapons that targeted the hive mind's synaptic connections, that severed bioships from the fleet consciousness, that turned Tyranid swarms into mindless animals that could be exterminated efficiently. The war created dead zones across dozens of sectors, regions where neither organic life nor mechanical constructs survived, where only barren rocks drifted through space, poisoned by necrodermis fragments and Tyranid spores that killed each other in an endless cycle. These dead zones expanded annually, consuming systems that had once held thriving civilizations. The Imperium marked them as forbidden space and warned ships to avoid them entirely. But pirates and renegades ventured into the dead zones seeking salvage. Some found Necron artifacts of immense power. Others discovered Tyranid biosamples that could be weaponized. A black market emerged, trading Xenos technology to the highest bidder. The Inquisition tried to suppress this trade but lacked resources to police every smuggler route. Forbidden technology proliferated across the Imperium. Some worlds used it to defend themselves. Others were destroyed by weapons they could not control. The galaxy became more dangerous, not through corruption, but through desperation. The Orcs reached their apex. without chaos to occasionally thin their numbers or distract their warghs, the greenskin population exploded. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka led the largest wargh. In recorded history, a migration of billions of orcs seeking the best fights in the galaxy. They smashed into Imperial space from the north, into Necron territory from the west, into Tyranid-infested regions from the east. The orcs did not care that they were surrounded by enemies more numerous and better equipped. They cared only that there was always something to fight. The orcs became the galaxy's stabilizing force, though they would never know or care. Wherever the Tyranids advanced too quickly, orcs appeared to slow them down. Wherever the Necrons pushed too far, WARs crashed into their tomb worlds with reckless abandon. The orcs' complete disregard for survival or strategy made them the perfect counter to both hyper-efficient factions. They could not win, but they could not be eliminated either. They bred too fast, fought too hard, and enjoyed every moment of their own destruction. The Eldar watched all of this with growing despair. The Farseers had cast billions of futures and saw the same ending in all of them. The galaxy would eventually be divided between Tyranids and Necrons, with orcs as an eternal third party creating just enough chaos to prevent either from achieving total dominance. Humanity's Imperium would fracture into pocket empires, each desperately clinging to survival. The Tau would be consumed entirely, the minor Xenos races would vanish from existence, and the Eldar themselves would fade into extinction, their numbers too few to matter in the wars between Titans. Eldrad Ulthran, oldest and wisest of all Farseers, meditated on this future and felt something he had not experienced in millennia. Acceptance. The Eldar's time was ending. They had ruled the galaxy once, had fallen to their own excess, and would not rise again. Slaaneish's absence did not change this fundamental truth. Their species was dying not because of a specific enemy, but because they were simply obsolete. The galaxy had moved beyond them, and no amount of prescience or planning could alter that fate. He shared this vision with other Farseers, and they responded with rage, denial, desperate planning. But Eldrad had seen too much, lived too long. He knew when a thread of fate was inevitable. So he changed his approach. Rather than trying to save the Eldar as a species, he began working to preserve their knowledge, their art, their achievements. He ordered the craft worlds to create sealed vaults containing everything the Eldar had learned in 60 million years of existence. These vaults would be hidden in the webway, in places so remote that even the galaxy's destruction might not reach them. Perhaps, in some distant age, after the current powers had burned themselves out, someone would find these vaults and learn from the Eldar's mistakes. It was a plan born of defeat, and Eldrad hated it. But he was a Farseer. He dealt in truth, no matter how painful. The Eldar were ending. The only question was whether they would end nobly, leaving something of value behind, or whether they would simply vanish into the silence. The Inari rejected this fatalism. Yvraine and her followers believed the birth of Inyad could still save them. They launched campaigns to awaken their god fully, gathering spirit stones from fallen craft worlds, conducting rituals in the webway's deepest reaches. Some Eldar joined them, many did not. The Inari became increasingly desperate, their methods more extreme. They began harvesting spirit stones from living Eldar, claiming the sacrifice was necessary to fuel Yniad's awakening. Civil war erupted across multiple craft worlds, as those who supported the Inari fought those who saw them as murderers. Biel-Tan tore itself apart. The craft world's warrior philosophy aligned with the Inari's aggressive approach, but its council of Farseers saw only doom in their methods. The craft world split down the middle, half its population following Yvraine, half remaining loyal to traditional paths. The craft world itself, that massive vessel that had survived for 10,000 years, began breaking apart under the stress. Its infinity circuit collapsed in sections, releasing the souls of ancient Eldar who screamed into the void. Biel-Tan became a ghost ship, haunted by the spirits of its own dead, drifting through space as a warning of what happened when hope became desperation. The dark Eldar of Comorak thrived. Without Slaanesh to fear, they could emerge from their hidden city more freely. Raids increased in frequency and audacity. Entire Imperial worlds were depopulated overnight, their populations dragged back to Commorragh for the arenas and the torture chambers. The homunculi perfected their arts without fear of demonic interference, creating new grotesqueries that served as weapons and entertainment. Commorragh expanded, annexing more of the webway, establishing satellite realms in particularly strategic locations. But Vecht, the supreme overlord of Commorragh, saw the larger truth. The Dark Eldar survived through suffering and inflicting it. Without an infinite supply of victims, their civilization would collapse, and the galaxy's population was shrinking. The Tyranids consumed worlds faster than they could repopulate. Imperial worlds fortified themselves against raiders. Even the orcs, once easy prey, had become more dangerous. Vecht began rationing raids, establishing quotas for suffering collection, creating a sustainable harvest schedule. The Dark Eldar adapted to their new reality. They could no longer feast endlessly. They had to farm. This shift changed Commorragh's culture fundamentally. The casual cruelty, the wasteful torture for mere amusement, had to be curtailed. Suffering became a resource to be managed, not squandered. Cabals that overharvested were punished. Homunculi who killed subjects too quickly were censured. The Dark Eldar became efficient in their evil, and somehow that was worse than their previous excess. They transformed from sadistic hedonists into cold industrialists of pain, calculating exactly how much suffering they could extract while keeping populations viable for future harvesting. The galaxy settled into a new pattern. Not peace, never peace, but a different kind of war. The Imperium held its core territories and abandoned the rest. The Tyranids consumed the outer reaches, always hungry, always advancing, but slowly, methodically, meeting resistance at every turn. The Necrons awakened tomb world by tomb world, each dynasty pursuing its own agenda, sometimes cooperating, often warring among themselves. The Orcs filled every gap, ensuring that no victory was ever complete, no conquest ever stable. On Terra, the Emperor remained silent on his throne. The Custodians maintained their vigil. The Astronomican continued burning, though its light grew dimmer each century as the sacrifice of psychers could no longer be maintained at previous rates. Some among the Adeptus Mechanicus quietly suggested that perhaps the Golden Throne could be turned off, that the Emperor could be allowed to die, that humanity might survive without him. These tech priests disappeared before they could share their research, because the Imperium needed its god, not the being on the throne, but the idea of him, the myth of the God Emperor who would one day rise and lead humanity to victory. Without that faith, the entire structure collapsed. So the Emperor remained trapped, neither living nor dead, powering a beacon that grew weaker every year, while the galaxy he had tried to unite splintered into 1,000 fragments. In the webway's deepest corridors, in places the Eldar had long ago abandoned and forgotten, something stirred. Not chaos. Chaos was gone. But the webway was old, older than any current race except perhaps the Necrons, and it contained secrets that had been sealed for reasons lost to time. The constant traffic of refugees and raiders, of Dark Eldar and Harlequins, of desperate humans seeking alternate routes through space, weakened seals that had held for millions of years. The first breach occurred in a tunnel near Real Space Intersection Point designated Mandragoran 9. A Drukhari raiding party traveling through heard a sound they could not identify. Scraping. Systematic. Mechanical. They investigated because Dark Eldar fear nothing and found a wall that had not been there before. Or rather, had always been there but invisible, cloaked by technology so advanced it made even the Eldar's artifacts seem crude. The wall was opening. The raiding party reported back to Commorragh, and Vecht dispatched specialists to investigate. They found evidence of construction, of chambers beyond chambers, of technology that predated the Eldar civilization. The specialists began cataloging their findings, taking samples, making careful notes. Then the wall fully opened, and something came through. The specialists' final transmission was 11 seconds of screaming and a visual record of shapes that human eyes could not properly process. Vecht sealed that section of the webway immediately. He told no one what had been found, but he began pulling resources away from raiding operations and toward internal security. The Dark Eldar, who had survived by hiding in the webway while Slaanesh devoured their empire, now faced the possibility that their refuge was not as safe as they believed, that the webway contained things even older and more dangerous than the Chaos Gods had been. The Harlequins knew. They had always known. Segorach, the Laughing God, had hidden his followers in the webway for a reason, not just to escape Slaanesh, but to guard something, to keep watch over seals and locks that held back horrors from the galaxy's first age. The Harlequins had maintained this vigil in secret, never speaking of it, because to speak of it was to draw attention to it. But now the seals were weakening, and the Harlequins prepared for a war they had hoped would never come. They began appearing in Imperial space, in Necron tomb worlds, in Tau settlements, delivering cryptic warnings. Most ignored them. The Harlequins were known for incomprehensible performances and bizarre behavior, but a few listened. A few understood that when the servants of the Laughing God spoke plainly, something terrible was approaching. On Ultramar, Guilliman received a Harlequin delegation in his private chambers. They performed a play without words, a dance of movements and colors that somehow conveyed meaning directly into his transhuman mind. What he learned made him immediately order the fortification of every webway portal within Imperium Secundus's territory. He dispatched assassination teams to destroy any artifacts or research related to webway technology. He classified everything under the highest seal and executed the researchers involved. The Primarch understood what most of the galaxy did not. Chaos had been a threat, yes. An existential nightmare that corrupted and destroyed. But chaos had been young. The warp gods had only existed for millions of years, not billions. They had been born from emotion and fed on suffering. They were comprehensible, in a way, because they were human vices made divine. Whatever the webway had been built to contain was older than human emotion, older than any current sapient race. It was a threat from the galaxy's first epoch, when the Old Ones had waged war against the Catan, when reality itself was more malleable and terrors beyond current understanding had walked among the stars. That war had ended. The Old Ones had died. The Catan had been shattered, the Necrons had gone to sleep, but the webway remained, and it had been built with purpose. It was not just a transport network, it was a prison, and Chaos's disappearance had weakened the bars. Guilliman looked at his strategic maps and realized the truth. The galaxy had not been saved. It had been given a temporary reprieve, a moment to prepare for something worse. Chaos had been the product of mortal emotion. It could be fought with faith and discipline and endless sacrifice. But what came next would be something that cared nothing for mortals, that existed according to rules reality no longer followed, that viewed all current life as insects to be swept aside. He did not share this knowledge widely. There was no point. The Imperium was already fracturing. Terra was besieged. The Tyranids were consuming the galaxy. The Necrons were awakening. Humanity was losing a war on every front. To tell them another threat loomed would break what little morale remained, so Guilliman quietly prepared. He redirected resources toward webway research, not to use it, but to understand it. He assigned special forces to watch known portal locations. He established protocols for what to do when the seals finally broke. Because they would break. The Harlequins had made that clear. The webway was vast beyond imagining, and every day more refugees fled into it, more raiders used it, more desperate factions sought its shelter. Each passage weakened the structure. Each intrusion stressed the ancient mechanisms. The seals that had held for 60 million years were failing, and when they broke, the galaxy would face something it was not equipped to survive. In the warp itself, in that dimension of souls and emotion where chaos had once reigned supreme, a new presence grew. It was not a god. It was not even alive in any meaningful sense. It was the cumulative psychic weight of the galaxy's despair. With chaos gone, that despair had nowhere to go, no outlet for expression. It pooled in the warp like blood in a wound, congealing into something that had not existed before. The Imperium scholars, those few who detected it, called it the Neverborn. Not because it had never been born, but because it should never have been allowed to exist. The Neverborn was what remained when you removed deliberate corruption. It was entropy given consciousness. The heat death of the universe expressed as a warp entity. It did not hate, it did not hunger, it simply existed, and its existence slowly drained meaning from reality. Systems near where it manifested reported strange phenomena, colors fading, sounds becoming muffled, emotions dulling until populations moved like automatons, going through life's motions without understanding why. The Eldar recognized it first. They had seen something similar before their fall, a precursor to Slaaneish's birth. But this was different. Slaanesh had been excess personified. The Neverborn was the opposite. It was the absence of everything. Where chaos had tempted and corrupted, offering power for damnation, the Neverborn simply leached away the will to resist. It did not need to conquer. It just needed to wait while everything wound down into stillness. The Imperium had no defense against it. How do you fight the absence of meaning? How do you crusade against apathy? The Ecclesiarchy tried preaching renewed faith, but their words felt hollow even to themselves. The Astra Militarum found soldiers deserting not to chaos or cowardice, but simply walking away, losing interest in warfare, in survival, in everything. The Space Marines, post-human warriors designed to know no fear, felt something they had never experienced: futility. Guilliman ordered the development of psychic shields, devices that could block the Neverborn's influence. The Mechanicus produced prototypes that worked for brief periods before failing. The effect was too subtle, too insidious. It did not attack. It did not invade. It simply flowed into any space left empty, and the galaxy was full of empty spaces. The irony was not lost on those who understood. The Imperium had prayed for chaos's destruction. They had begged the Emperor for salvation from damnation. They had been granted that wish. Chaos was gone. Daemons no longer stalked the galaxy. Corruption had ceased, and in that absence, something worse had emerged. Not evil, just ending. The slow, inevitable conclusion to everything. Some worlds chose to end themselves. Entire populations, realizing the futility of continuing, simply stopped. They sat in their habs and hive cities and waited for death. No violence, no panic, just acceptance. The Imperium's relief forces found ghost cities, populations dead from dehydration and starvation because they had forgotten why eating mattered. These deaths were classified as plague outbreaks because the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. In the depths of the warp, something that had once been the Emperor observed all of this and did nothing. Perhaps it could not act. Perhaps it chose not to. The being on the Golden Throne had spent 10,000 years fighting chaos, holding back the tide, protecting humanity from damnation. That battle was won. The enemy was defeated. Whatever purpose had animated the Emperor through those millennia of agony had been fulfilled. What remained was tired beyond comprehension, worn down to nothing but echoes of will and duty. The Psychers who fed the Golden Throne, that daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls, began reporting strange dreams. They dreamed they were feeding something that was already dead, that the Emperor had died the moment chaos vanished, and only the momentum of 10,000 years of sacrifice kept him animated. That they were pouring their souls into an empty vessel, maintaining a corpse because the Imperium could not accept that its god was truly gone. These dreams were heresy of the highest order. The Psychers who reported them were executed immediately. But the dreams persisted, spreading through the black ships that collected them, infecting those who served the Golden Throne most directly. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica began censoring all communications related to the Emperor's state, but you cannot censor dreams. Every Psyker in the galaxy eventually experienced the same vision, a golden figure on a throne of bones, unmoving, unthinking, maintained by nothing but ritual and fear of what would happen if the ritual stopped. Terra's astropath sent a message to Ultramar. It took 6 months to arrive, the warp currents being unpredictable as always. The message was brief. The light dims. Make ready. Guilliman. Understood. The Astronomican was failing. Not dramatically. not in any way the Imperium's navigators had been trained to handle. It was simply fading, like a candle burning down to its last wick. Within a century, maybe less, it would gutter out entirely, and when it did, the Imperium would fragment into isolated systems, unable to navigate the warp, cut off from all support. The Primarch made preparations. He ordered the construction of secondary beacon stations, trying to create a network that could replace the Astronomican. The Mechanicus worked tirelessly, but their technology was insufficient. The Emperor's power was simply too vast to replicate through machinery. Some tech priests suggested alternatives. Psyker choirs synchronized through Mechanicus rituals. Artificial warp entities constructed from bound souls. Guilliman refused all suggestions that sounded too much like chaos, but his options were narrowing. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. A Necron, Cryptek, seeking audience with the Primarch, appeared in Ultramar's capital. How it bypassed security, none could determine. It simply materialized in Guilliman's strategium and spoke with a voice like grinding stone. You seek to maintain a beacon. You understand incorrectly. The beacon was not your Emperor's gift. It was his prison. You have maintained his cage for 10 millennia, feeding him souls to keep him from dying and transcending. Now he has defeated his enemy, and you still will not free him. Your species' cruelty knows no bounds. Guilliman executed the Cryptek personally, driving his power sword through its living metal skull. But the words remained. The custodians present reported the incident as Xenos madness, but privately, they discussed the implications. What if the Emperor had wanted to die? What if maintaining the Golden Throne was not preserving humanity's savior but torturing him beyond any reasonable limit? What if the greatest service they could render was to end his suffering? These thoughts were never spoken aloud outside the custodian's most private chambers. They could not be. The Imperium would tear itself apart if anyone suggested the Emperor should be allowed to die. But the seed was planted, and it grew in the minds of those closest to the throne. The galaxy stumbled toward an ending it could not avoid. The Tyranids consumed, the Necrons awakened, the Orcs fought, humanity fractured, the Eldar faded, the Neverborn spread. The Webway's seals weakened, and on Terra, a being that had once been human and was now something incomprehensible remained trapped on a throne of technology and bone, unable to die, unable to live, simply enduring because that was all it knew how to do. In the end, the galaxy learned a truth it had tried to deny for 100 centuries. There are no victors, not in the grim darkness of the far future. Chaos had been defeated, yes, but defeating one enemy only cleared space for others. Removing the dark gods did not create peace. It created a vacuum that needed filling, and what filled it was not better, just different, equally terrible in its own way. The question was never who would win a galaxy without chaos. The question was always whether winning even mattered, whether any outcome was meaningfully different from any other, whether the galaxy itself was worth saving, or if everything would be better off simply ending. And as the Astronomican continued its slow fade, as the Imperium's light dimmed star by star, as the last hope crumbled under the weight of infinitely multiplying threats, the answer became clear. There is no salvation, there is no victory, there is only war. And in the absence of chaos, that war becomes nothing but empty slaughter, meaningless violence grinding on forever because there is nothing else left to do. The galaxy without chaos is not a galaxy redeemed. It is a galaxy that has lost even the dignity of damnation. What remains is simply ending, slow, inevitable, and utterly, utterly pointless.